Folks, welcome. This is series 2. We're into a set of discussions with leaders of national organisations on leadership and culture in healthcare podcast. And I am delighted that today I'm joined by Ian Trenholm from the Care Quality Commission. Ian, welcome. Why don't you explain who you are and who you work for, and maybe then get into what on earth does the Care Quality Commission do for those that don't know who are listening to this podcast today?
Sure. Thanks, Matthew, and hello, everybody. So, I'm Ian Trenholm. I'm the chief executive of the Care Quality Commission. The Care Quality Commission is an organisation that is the regulator for health and social care in England, that's kind of I've been quite deliberately chopped that up into parts because we're often sort of seen as the regulator for the NHS. That's about half of what we do. The other half is in social care. Broadly speaking, about half of what we do is public sector. About half of what we do is private sector. There's about 50,000 locations that range from a multi-billion-pound NHS acute trust through to an owner-operator domiciliary care business, and all points in between, including ambulances and private ambulances and baby scanning clinics and a whole range of things that people don't often talk about. But they are involved in some kind of treatment of disorder, disease, or injury. So there's a set of criteria to be registered. Once you're registered, there's a set of regulations that apply. And then what we do is we then, I guess, have a purpose which has two parts to it. The first part is we provide the public with assurance around the safety and quality of care. And we do that, we're well known for the work we do around inspections and all of that kind of stuff and the reports that we write. The second part of what we do, which I think we're interested in doing more of, is around promoting improvement. It's about identifying the things we're seeing out on inspection, looking for the good stuff, looking at the good stuff and then amplifying that. And of course, picking up on the things where people are struggling. And increasingly, we're starting to try and join the dots nationally and starting to say, we can talk to an individual provider, but it's even more powerful if we can start to bring together what we're seeing on a national stage and start to make some comments about what we're seeing nationally. So, kind of quite complex work in one sense, quite broad ranging. And we work collaboratively with other regulators, both who do the same sort of job as us in the other devolved nations, because quite a lot of social care is actually delivered through large groups who operate in Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland. But also we see what we do alongside other regulators, so particularly the professional regulators. Normally if the GMC are worried about a place, we're worried about it as well, and we talk to each other. We have formal ways of talking to each other, and we see our regulatory impact through what we call 8 impact levers. And often people talk about our impact through enforcement or some variant of enforcement. That's a part of what we do, but it's a relatively small part. Actually, we have more bang for our buck by building relationships, by running workshops, by writing independent voice pieces, state of care, these sorts of things, which are about building relationships, starting to draw in other people like NHS England, for example, and say, look, we're a bit worried about this location or this area. Can we work together on it? This is not an enforcement conversation. It's a look. Actually, we're starting to see something peeling away from the curve, and we just need to do something about that collectively before it gets to bigger things. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do.
So an interesting nutshell, because that is so multifaceted, isn't it? I probably didn't realise that 50% of what you do is in the profit sector or in independent, I should say, not profit necessarily. So Ian, let me just kind of drill into a few of those areas if you can, because I think I imagine quite a lot of what you described as those 3 big kind of registration, assurance, and then improvement. A lot of people won't necessarily see all that. And then you've talked about the levers that you then have an impact. How do you do that then? So for people that wouldn't know, you've just talked about working with people to improve care. What would your directors, your staff, what would people, if they looked in, see them doing as a regulator, doing that activity, rather than, I think, as you say, some of the traditional views of a regulatory approach, which I think certainly those who provide healthcare would understand on being on the receiving end of that occasionally. How do you do the other bits?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it starts sort of on an inspection, I guess, when you've got an individual inspector who's chatting to, a frontline practitioner about something. You often find our inspectors will say, "Oh, that's really interesting. I saw a place down the road, they had the same problem and they dealt with it in a slightly different way." So there's that kind of, if you want to give it a jazzy label, you could call it micro coaching. But it is that kind of sharing of knowledge informally, because my teams have the sort of that privilege of perspective. They're in locations, every day up and down the country, and in a range of different locations. Because I think sometimes, particularly the NHS, sort of sees itself as a coherent whole, and it tries to learn from other parts of the NHS. Whereas actually, I'd argue that there's quite a lot the NHS could learn from social care and vice versa. And we, potentially have a role to play there. So that's can we start on that kind of frontline informal conversation. I think you then look at the reports that we write, where we try and identify things that are going well, things that people could look at. Sometimes we point out things that we're saying, look, this really must improve for this reason. So there's a sort of, not necessarily enforcement or any of that sort of stuff, but it's it's something in the report. And then you click up a level again, and what you're saying is we're starting to look at themes and trends across particular areas. So we've done some work recently, also over the last sort of couple of years, really, on maternity in particular, where we inspected every maternity service in the country. And we're about to produce a summary report that talks about some of the things we've learned through that work. It talks, and as part of that process, we've done the same thing in emergency medicine, where we brought practitioners together and we've said, we've seen all these things on inspection. We bring practitioners in a room, and we recognize that as the regulator, if we call you and invite you to a workshop, you're likely to come. People do, and that's great, because we can bring Royal Colleges to the table. We can kind of convene people together who maybe wouldn't naturally come together, and we can bring in the voices of people who use services as well. We have some great relationships with charities, and you bring all that together, and it kind of, we create a bit of a melting pot to say, well, what does good look like in emergency medicine? What could good look like in maternity? And then we can produce learning products and so forth. We produce podcasts and all that kind of stuff as well. And then ultimately, once a year we produce the state of care report, which again pulls out the big macro trends. But I think what we've recognized over a number of years is that the essence of what we do is writing a sort of come on site, do an inspection, write a long form report. I mean, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, as you appreciate, but as a product, the product is the long form report. And that has always been quite difficult to pick out the attributes of what good looks like, or the attributes of what not good looks like. And so we've introduced a new single assessment framework, and the aim of that is to try and almost deconstruct our work into ways where we have 34 quality statements. And these quality statements are in areas that people will be very familiar with. They link back to our previous methodology, but it does mean that we can now capture our judgments in much smaller fragments, and we can start to combine those fragments together. Because my hypothesis is that those organizations with a good culture have a certain set of attributes, but sometimes those attributes are not necessarily that obvious. And equally, there are attributes where people consistently struggle to deliver good care. Why is that? And I think oftentimes we talk about that at an individual institution level, and we sort of say hospital X or community trust Y is or is not very good, because what we don't say is actually we're seeing that organizations with that sort of size and shape, with that sort of serving a community with these characteristics, always struggles to work to do well. And it's a conversation I know many providers have talked to us about around context. saying to us, look, we're never going to be an outstanding trust because look at the context, look at the community that we serve, look at our budget, look at all of those sorts of things. And the question for us is, how do we reflect that without colluding with the notion of poor care for difficult communities? And that's always going to be a problem. But what the single assessment framework tries to do is to effectively kind of turn the work that we do into a massive qualitative research program. One of the products of which is an inspection report and a rating, but it does mean we've got a data set which we can use, which academics can use, which others can use to start to say, actually, there's a bit more to this culture thing than maybe meets the eye.
Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I imagine that's quite, whoever is trying to argue that we could never be outstanding because of X, Y, and Z. I can imagine that's a fierce topic of debate.
Yes, it is.
Not quite sure I would ever try and argue that one way or the other. But when a couple of podcasts ago, we had Michael West talking about using the survey information as an elements of the staff survey information to be a predictor of what is going to happen, both in terms of quality, probably productivity, staff involvement, then being also a very good predictor of how you're going to be successful, and aligning all of those things in an intelligent and evidence-based way to say, actually, you have or haven't got the ingredients to thrive. Put aside, there are other factors how you can thrive. Is quite an interesting judgment call, because my guess is that's not linear and completely definitive, is it? It's a judgment call on, are those ingredients the right things that we can be confident on?
It is. I mean, I think, we've, alongside the single assessment framework, we've done a load of work in the background around replacing all our technology systems, and we've got a big data analytics team, data insight team, and bringing all those factors together. What I think that does is it gives us the opportunity to create some hypotheses, I think, and some data-driven hypotheses, because I think sometimes people can sort of almost pick winners and say, well, if you've got A and B present, then there's likely to be a good culture, and that might be true. But I think it's quite judgment based, and quite individual judgment based. Whereas I'd quite like to be in a position where we can create a data driven hypothesis around things which are traditionally quite qualitative in nature, like culture, and then we can examine that hypothesis. I mean, I definitely stop short of saying, if you run the data, the AI says the answer is this, because I think that's a dangerous game to play. But by the same token, what we're managing to do, I think, is to be more consistent as an organization, so consistently looking at individual things, but then in being in a position to sort of start to deconstruct that, to say, what are the characteristics of good, what are the characteristics of struggling, and then being able to sort of start to aggregate that across different providers, because I think there are things that social care groups do, in part because they are oftentimes relatively small institutions with operating to very low margins, but doing a fairly common activity. There are some things that they do which are not echoed in the NHS, and the question is there some logic? Is there some read across between those two things? And can CQC act as a catalyst, as a convener for some different sorts of conversations, particularly when you get into conversations around productivity. I think the NHS is under a lot of pressure at the moment around productivity, and whilst productivity isn't our core business, as it were, in terms of inspecting productivity, we're on the cusp, as we speak, we're on the cusp of an election, and whichever government, whichever party comes in, they will be very interested in driving productivity up. I'd argue there are some lessons to be learned from social care. We may be able to help with pointing those lessons out. Social care in particular does some really good stuff with technology, because it does it in a really straightforward, not bespoke manner. Whereas I think the NHS tends to sort of see technology in it through a very different lens, and I think that lack of cash in social care drives a certain hunger and a certain mindset sometimes, which the NHS could possibly learn from, and
So,
indeed vice versa.
and that's an interesting observation, isn't it? So, given your health and social care responsibilities, you've mentioned innovation there, you've mentioned digitalization, you've mentioned productivity differences between the sector. I'm just intrigued, are there things that you've noticed in, therefore, leadership that you see within the social care world, or maybe in the independent sector world, that is different than, say, is manifesting in the NHS world? Are there any themes around that you and the team have kind of picked up?
I think there's an interesting thing if you walk into a hospital in particular, and to some extent, I think this is true in community trust. You've got lots of different services that are trying to work together, and inevitably, there's a sort of as soon as you put lots of different things in the same place, there's a degree of competition springs up in various different ways. Kind of competition for budget, competition for beds, competition for whatever it is, resources of one form or another. Um, Whereas what I think you see in social care is generally, a care home does care home things. A learning disability location does, looks after a group of people. There's individual care plans for those individuals, and that's where the differentiation takes place. But what you see, I think, often is I think leaders that genuinely have ownership of their bit of business. So you've got to, if you're running a care home, if you're the care home manager, you put your arms around your 50 bedded care home, and you perceive you own it, and um, you don't necessarily get the same level of kind of deep visceral ownership in a service manager in a hospital or a community trust. And there are rights and wrongs to that, because you sometimes see care home managers who are kind of in at weekends and evenings and sort of really deeply owning it, and that has a that's a from a well-being point of view, that's a challenge in and of itself. But is it sort of they almost see it as owning their bit of the business, even though in practical terms they don't, but that's how they view, and that makes a difference in terms of how they set the culture, how they kind of almost want to deliver care in quite a homely way in social care, whereas in the NHS, I think there's often a tendency to sort of see it as, right, we need to cycle people through, and that's inevitably um, the nature of healthcare versus some kind of residential care. Um, but there is something about, is there some learning to do, would be the sort of open question, really.
Yeah. Interesting. My conversations with other chief execs as part of series one of these podcasts, all at once, and they all had great star survey outcomes, which is why we were having the conversations. All of them talk about the simplicity of how care is both delivered and led as being a key element of their
Yeah.
success, but also defined accountability and clarity of purpose. And that kind of goes to the heart of what you're saying, is actually, in some respects,
Yeah.
the sector may be a more simpler model because it's less complex in its diversity. However, within that, you can be really clear on accountability to make a change in your area. And do we in the NHS overcomplicate that question? Not asking you to
Yeah.
say that, but
No,
there is something interesting in that conundrum, isn't there?
absolutely. And it's where the point of complexity is.
Yeah.
Because in a care home, everybody's got an individual care plan. Everyone has an individual experience in their room, in their space. Whereas in an NH, in a large acute hospital, people are in a ward who are essentially getting the same stuff, and that may be the right model. But I think it is that, where does that point of complexity sit, is quite an
Mm.
interesting thing.
Fascinating. And just traversing back to something you talked about, how the Care Quality Commission operate now, and you've talked about thematic analysis, improvement. I guess, I've been at my job for a long time as an accountable, so far too long, and I've been through many CQC processes. It wasn't that long ago that, when we had the conversation with, let's just characterize what it might be. You're not doing well enough, and the question is, well, what's good, and can you point to where that is good? The response from the inspector would have been, no, we're not an improvement agency, we're an inspection
Yeah,
agency. So
yeah,
that's quite a big
yeah,
shift in an organization in what I would say is probably only 5, 6, 7 years in reality. I mean, A, am I right in kind of characterizing
mm,
that? And B,
yeah,
you've clearly then as a team made quite big changes in the culture of how the Care Quality Commission works. So how have you gone about that
yeah,
change?
yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, you're right. It's specifically just say it before I to preamble this is, we're not an improvement agency, and we're quite deliberately not. And I sort of I characterize it every time I speak to someone about this, which is, we will never be a management consultancy style improvement agency putting people on site with the sole purpose of improvement. But going back to the point I made earlier on about impact levers, if we see ourselves, every regulator has to have an impact on the sector that they regulate, and they do that in a range of different ways. And so for me, bringing a group of people together, either in a geography, around a particular sector or around a topic, and saying, look, this is what we're seeing. What do you think as practitioners? How can we, what would you, how could we help you improve? What should we be looking out for? The answer, the famous "what gets measured gets done" sort of stuff. How should we evolve our methodology to look for the things that make the biggest difference? That's what we mean by improvement, I think, and being in a position where we can also, particularly in a particularly a post-COVID world, I think what we saw with the public was a sort of this massive support for the NHS, and then massive as the backlog started to build up, people sort of almost turned against the NHS in some places, and I think you still get that now. I think we do have a role to talk about the good things that are going on, and support improvement. But this is never, hands-on, here's an improvement director, that sort of thing. That sort of role will always sit with NHS England or other improvement agencies. So, and you see, and you sort of you see the work that we do with NHS England on this in the NHS. It is much more difficult to do this in social care, actually, because there isn't an equivalent of NHS England. And so, our levers are a bit more binary, kind of either you're open or we close you down. We don't close hospitals down, we don't close trusts down. But we don't have many options in terms of social care. So I think for us it's the improvement piece is about redoubling our efforts around how we work with other people, and rather than doing it ourselves if you like, in the very conventional way. But
But
it was
I
in our
guess
strategy.
that,
We put it in our strategy quite deliberately.
yeah.
We refreshed our strategy a couple of years ago, and we put that in the strategy quite deliberately.
Then how did you make that change with your teams? Because lots of them would have come into the CQC and be, trained in the methodology, as you
Yeah,
said, a methodology and approach that needs absolute rigor given the importance of what you do. How have you and the team had to go about then, because that's a set of nudges. It was more than that. It's kind of saying a little bit of a mindset shift here, folks, and you've got
yeah,
a very dispersed workforce across the whole of
yeah.
England, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think, we've got people, when I talk to some of um, I think older members of staff, but older members of the team who've been around for a while, they will have come from predecessor agencies that were very compliance based, and they talk about compliance based inspection, and you counted this and you tick that off. I think what we've tried to do as we've evolved our old methodology over time, and indeed with the new methodology, we kind of there are still things which are in essence compliance based. If we're going to look at a drugs cupboard in a care home, there's only really one right way, and if there's stuff missing or whatever, then that's a problem. Um, but but in terms of we're doing a lot more work on things which are not compliance based in the orthodox sense, looking at things like inequalities. We're looking at issues like culture, and we're spending a lot more time on that. We're listening to the patient voice. That the new methodology has a big component within it around the voice of people that use services, and also the voices of the people that work in services as well. And I think, those sorts of things which have traditionally been seen as quite qualitative. Again, we're trying to structurally capture that, and then we can get into this thing that sort of, I suppose, to your earlier point around well, the people have said, which is, if the staff survey is not very good, what can you practically do to move that on? Because that then translates into quality of care, and that's only one measure of of many measures. But I think from our point of view, what we're trying to do with my own teams is to make sure that the guidance we issue, the training we give them, the management culture that goes with that is all about, right, okay, what's good about this? You'd often sit in review meetings and managers will be going, okay, well, we've heard about what's bad in this location, right? What's good in this location? What should we be having in the report? And simple things like, in our press releases, we now always say something positive, if you will, at the start. I mean, there's a lot to choose from, but that we always try and make sure that we don't start with this organization is terrible, when very few organizations are
Yeah.
are universally. I mean, I've always been very struck in our reports where an inadequate provider will have examples of outstanding practice, and an outstanding provider will have examples of inadequate practice. I think it's just a question of where the balance lies.
Yeah, and materiality in that respect, absolutely.
Yes, yeah.
Couple of other areas I just wanted, before I talk a little bit about you and your leadership style, Ian, if I can. You made that point about there is a responsible organisation for the NHS, being NHS England, and I guess it's not just the NHS; it's also the areas that they commission from. So the independent sector, in some respects, get pulled under their purview for those that are providing NHS care. You've got a healthcare independent world, which is private in itself or independent, and you've got the social care world. What you said you don't have levers, but what actually are the levers at a national level, that if you say I guess I'm interested in, when you've got an organization that you might be worried about on a historic basis, let's go with that, or you've one of your themed areas, whether it be maternity or somewhere else, and you're saying, no, there are definite structural or sector or service elements in here. Are there compulsion issues that you can pull with other statutory national organisations to say, I need you to do this? How does that operate, so people kind of get a better understanding around that?
Yeah, in extremis, to an extent, I'm sort of, there isn't an obvious big lever, marked, pull this lever, and and things happen nationally. I'm just trying to think of some sort of very practical examples. The way that our legislation is set up, if you go right back to sort of our founding legislation, it is set up for us to be an organisation that looks at individual providers. It doesn't really recognise NHS England as an entity. It doesn't recognise other agencies, really. What it essentially says is, we, the CQC, will go on site to look at that provider based on their registration, and then we will apply the regulations to that registered provider. And in theory, we could just do nothing else other than just apply the regulations, take court action, and ultimately remove the registration of that provider. But of course, the world is much more complex and nuanced than that, as you'd expect. So we have a range of kind of formal and informal links. So my teams are talking to colleagues in NHS England on a weekly, in some cases daily basis, about a range of different topics, and a range of different organisations, and talking at regional level and so on. We also have what we call an emerging concerns protocol, which is a relationship that we've got with a number of regulators. So if one regulator, General Pharmaceutical Council, for example, says, we've had a number of complaints about drugs prescribing in in this organization or around this organization or this cluster of GPs or whatever, then they will call the protocol in place. We'll all look at that and go, that's interesting. And I've had situations where we've had concerns about an organization. We've talked to colleague regulators, GMC, NMC have looked at the experience that trainee doctors, trainee nurses are getting in a place. They've then said, this is interesting. We've then said, well, we're going to do these things in terms of warning notices and put registration conditions on. They then withdraw trainees, and there's things like that. So we try and work in concert so that we understand the consequences of actions, and we'll always discuss those actions with NHS England, either at a regional or a national level, and we try not to completely disrupt the way the world works. We know that some institutions are the anchor institution in their place. Some trusts are the only ones delivering that service for quite a long distance. If we then stop them from doing that, and we have on occasion done that, if we've got some real safety concerns, then that becomes problematic. So if we're going to do that, then we try and call in others and say, and to some extent it's an invitation rather than compulsion, if I'm honest. If it never happens, but if NHS England said, look, you know what, we can't fix that, or we don't want to fix that, then we would carry on using our legal powers and do what we need to do. But usually we can get to a point where we can drive improvements in some way, shape, or form.
Just in that answer and that description, there's a huge set of balances, judgment calls. That thing about if we put regulatory action against you, but you're the only people that could do it, that's a major problem for local. But at the same time, standards are so crucial, etc. So that must be a tough thing for your team to do, as well as the emerging concerns protocol. Your really important national role on saying, are we joining the dots up with other people, and did we all know about it yet didn't work together? Those are huge competing demands, aren't they, as you as leaders?
Oh, definitely. I think as you have this, as leaders, you have this really difficult risk-based conversation, which is the easy thing from a completely selfish CQC point of view would be to close a place down. Because if you do that, then there can be no more poor care delivered from that place. So there you go then. But we saw that, we see this every winter with ambulance queues. The decision is always, I'm worried about that A&E, but if you close that A&E down, or you limit its scope of practice, we sometimes will maybe ask that an A&E does not operate at night, for example, because they can't staff it properly. And that's quite a thing to do, because it means that ambulances are now driving to another A&E. Does that A&E have the capacity to do it? And is the risk of somebody driving an hour in a different direction greater than leaving a place open that's maybe requires improvement or is really struggling to staff a safe service? And that is not a simple balance of risk, but it's a balance of risk that we try and take as a regulator. And and any clinician who's listening to this podcast will completely recognize that judgment call, and you as a chief exec will recognize that if we do that, it's got to offset against that. Very little of what we do is binary, and yet people often see what we do as binary, and to some extent the rating system is a good thing in the sense that it shows a simple ratings the public understand. But I think it also gives a slight sense that what we do is a fairly straightforward, tick these boxes and then this answer comes out, when actually most of what we do is about balancing risk and looking for partners to help us balance that risk, and drawing them in to mitigate risk. So it's a very kind of complex risk management process. And what we've done
at the same time, Ian, as not kind of fallen into the trap of moving away from an objective stance that this is good, this is what great care should be about, and be really clear about it. And that's always an immovable object for you, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think to some extent, I know the people will have different views on ratings, and in some respects the bane of my life in terms of people debating the ratings. But what the ratings do, they offer a sort of early warning, because it's much easier to, if you've got an organization that's gone from, good to maybe requires improvement, it's a shot across the bows. People can debate, whether that's the right rating or not. But fundamentally, if you're a leadership team and your organization deteriorates, you will lean into that and try and do something about whatever it is we've pointed out. That means that the standard of care bumps up, and that's a positive for the public. If you don't have ratings, you end up in this slightly binary situation of either you're all compliant and it's fine, and suddenly you're not. And as a leader, that's a really difficult thing to do, because we know as chief execs that you don't know every single transaction that's going on in your organization in real time all of the time. You can't possibly. So you do have to rely on assurances that you get from organizations like ours. So it is really important that in the rating system offers that sort of early warning system, which then people can then use to put a bit more resource into a service or an approach, and try and fix it before it deteriorates. It's always easier to fix the RIs than it is to try and turn something around that's inadequate.
Yeah, yeah. And then last thing on this before I move on, you mentioned your legislative, get my teeth in there, legislative framework is quite old now. It was set up originally, and you definitely even got NHS England reference in there. And we're recording this during Purdah, but published after the election, so I think we're all right talking about this. Does this mean that actually would be helpful that framework was revised and updated to really be clear about the interconnectivity? Because I guess my view is both the levers and the regulatory and the national leadership world is so vastly different from when the CQC was started that potentially could create some gaps that are unnecessary, if I put it that way.
Yeah, so yes and no. I mean, I think if you look at the last update to the Health and Social Care Act, it talked about us offering assurance around local authorities' Care Act duties. It also talked about us getting involved in assurance around ICSs, and that work sort of continues. So in that sense, that sort of picks some of that stuff up. But what we don't do at the moment, and this is true in both health and social care, we don't register groups. So in other words, the NHS England, I mean, this is going to sound silly, but I'm going to say it anyway. NHS England is effectively a big healthcare group in the same way that Spire or Bupa or any of those others are. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than I know, but for the purpose of this conversation, it's a good comparison. So NHS England don't deliver care in a direct way. Therefore, we've got no powers to register them, and arguably, nor should we. I remember a while back having a conversation with a large insurance company, health insurance company, that felt it would be a good thing for them to register as with CQC, because they wanted to register, they wanted to expose themselves to the rigor of regulation. But we struggled to find a way to do that, because they don't deliver care in a direct way. And so whilst they were, they saw it as a business benefit, they saw it as a positive. You need to be in the care business, the direct delivery of care business. So, in the same with with social care groups, we don't register individual care home groups as an entity. We register the care homes that they work. So it's in some respects that probably doesn't need to change, because of the level of complexity there that doesn't really help. What we are starting to talk to people about, though, is just understanding how we gather evidence, because particularly in social care, you get broadly two types of group structures, one of which is where they do a lot of services from the centre, like all of their policies are generated from the centre. They are imposed upon their respective care homes. And so the question we ask is, are you following that policy? But if you're a care home group with 100 homes in it, we're asking the question 100 times. And so that's, if we could ask that question effectively once and then just check it's being it's being followed, then that's easier for us. It's easier for them. It makes a bit more sense. And the NHS is a more complex beast because of trusts and independence within the trusts and so forth. So so I think that's a complex area. The area that we are doing some work on and have been for a while now with the department is on changing some of the background regulations, because one of the big things that I've had a concern about for a while now is the way that digital services are delivered. It is possible to acquire drugs from overseas using a range of providers and then have the prescription filled in the UK. And we've had some real challenges with that. And when we and GPHC get together and sort of look at this, we realize this is actually all technically perfectly legal, if quite dangerous. And so there are some services that I think we want to bring into regulation. I think there are some emerging services like fillers in beauty therapy and those sorts of things, which are increasingly being administered by individuals who are not medically trained. And ironically, there's a number of services like that. Earwax removal is another one, which again sounds like a modest service, but if you're a registered nurse and you're delivering these services, you do need to be registered with us. If you are not a registered nurse, you or I perhaps, we don't need to be registered at all. So the public doesn't really know that. So there are some examples of retail high street type services that are springing up, some of which are more conventionally healthcare, some of which are more kind of optional in terms of cosmetics, which are never registered, and that I think is a potential risk for the public, and that's what we want to try and work with the department to change.
And distinct possibility of not doing it well have lasting problems, ethical issues and audiological just you shudder at the thought of them. Ian, pulling this together then, talk about you as a leader. How do you characterize this podcast all about culture and leadership and all things around it in the broader healthcare world? How do you characterize yourself as a leader? Because people listening to this podcast will look at the range of what your organization does and think, wow, that must take very adaptive leadership. So I'm not pushing you down one way or the other, but what's your flavor of how you operate?
Yeah. I mean, on a personal level, I would sort of, I've got a CV, which, I did a geology degree. I've been a police. I was in my 20s as a police officer. I've worked in the public and private sector. I've worked in central government. I've worked in local governments, and immediately prior to this was the chief exec at NHS Blood and Transplant. And if people ask me what how I characterize my profession, I would say I'm an operations management leader. I think so. I'm a leader in that space. And if you kind of go from there, I'd say there is something about, as a consequence, needing to be pretty flexible in your leadership approach. So I kind of there are some examples, so some instances where the leadership challenge you've got in front of you is a command and control one, some of which is about addressing a wicked issue, some of which is about kind of a managerial challenge. And I think as an ops management professional, if you will, you have to be in a position where, as a leader, you can be competent in all of those spaces, and not try and impose one type of leadership on a set of circumstances which don't really work. I think you sometimes see people who kind of know that they enjoy command and control style of leadership, and they just impose that on every problem that's put in front of them. And other people, who kind of, who just sort of say, I get bored with management stuff, so therefore I just don't do it, or I delegate it to somebody and so forth. And I think from my point of view, I don't think I can do that. I've got to be in a position where I can, be the best I can possibly be in each of those areas. And the only way you get to do that, I think, is to be quite curious. And I did an MBA a few years ago, and I think one of the things that I learned from doing a master's degree was the need to continuously update yourself, continuously rethink your practice as a leader. And I think leadership is a practice. It's it's not something that you're kind of born with. It's something you can develop and improve. And you've got to be kind of, quite reactive, I suppose, to the circumstances, because I think in a post-COVID world, I think we've all found what we need to do as leaders is profoundly different to the way it was pre-COVID.
And finally, Ian, what are you looking forward to over the next stretch? We'll have new government in. You've talked about all the things you do in organisation, but what are you kind of privately and professionally kind of looking forward to kind of keep the Trenholm hours suitably kind of engaged and the neurons going? What's that going to be?
Yeah, I think there is something about looking forward to continuing to uh, look for better ways to delivering care. I think there's some great people at work across health and social care, and it's an enormous privilege. That privilege of perspective that I get. I get to go and see people in a range of different places, and talk to them about what they're doing. And there's just an enormous pride, whether it's a small domiciliary care business, whether it's a large hospital, and so there's just enormous pride there, and that's brilliant. The question that or the thing that I'm kind of looking forward to is I think having a bit of stability in whatever flavor the next government is, having some stability to start to tap into that pride to really kind of almost kick on from COVID, because I sort of feel like we've all we've staggered a little bit to get back to our feet after COVID. And I think there's something, the thing we all have to be optimistic around is, there is a way through this in some way, but we need a bit of stability, and then we need to look forwards and say, can we use all of the tools, all of the skills at our disposal to make a real difference for people who use services.
Ian, thank you. Has echoes of a chief executive in an earlier episode who very much talked about the public service elements of what we do as leaders and being able to do that, fully. And you've mapped out really interestingly what your regulatory world does, what your organization does, that mixture of 50% independent, 50% public, huge health and social care responsibilities, important, providing public assurance on inspection is, not to be underestimated, and the important things your team have done, continue to do, the levers that they pull, the way that you join the dots with other organizations, the way that you balance that improvement that one needs along with clear standards, and being able to do that in a sympathetic and appropriate way, and how you do that. It's been fabulous to listen to how you do that as a leader, and thank you for spending time with me on leadership and culture in healthcare and sharing insights into the Care Quality Commission.
Fantastic. It's great to have the conversation. Thanks, Matthew.